everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for a topic that has been covered in many different ways, many different discussions, but hopefully never quite with this focus, which is looking at specifically rural areas. Are they being taken for granted under this government? And what are the Conservatives going to do about it? I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by this brilliant panel. Thank you first and foremost to the CLA for partnering with us on this topic. I have Mark Bridgman here with me, who is the president of the CLA. We are also joined by the Minister for Rural Affairs and Biosecurity, Lord Benyon, and hiding on the end is Neil Parish, who is the chair of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. We will have plenty of time for questions, so please do start thinking of what you would like, all the very difficult things you would like to put to this distinguished panel. But first off, I will hand over to Mark for his opening remarks.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming along. So I think the context here, taken for granted, I think the Conservative Party have obviously control of rural areas. If you think of the seats that they control, nearly all of them, of the 180 or so rural seats, or almost all Conservative. And I think what we're concerned about is that area is being slightly taken for granted. We did some work before the last election looking at what we termed the rural powerhouse, how rural areas were 18% less productive than the wider economy. And if you can close that gap, the massive economic potential that unlocks, 43 billion of GVA. But what are the impediments? And we've published this Levelling Up booklet. Levelling Up is the term of the moment, as we all know, and that should be on your seat. And where we really try and get under the skin of what some of the issues are and how we can close that gap. Because I think we should be optimistic about the opportunities in rural areas. I think if COVID's shown us anything, it's shown us that rural areas have got a most fantastic future. That's where people actually want to be. But there are some challenges ahead. Rural areas shouldn't just be about retirement homes for wealthy people to go and retire to. It shouldn't be about second home ownership. And it needs to be living, working, and thriving economies. And the things that we really highlight in here, which I think are where government can help, is around things like infrastructure, connectivity. We all think about connectivity, broadband, and mobile, but also electric connectivity. If we're going to get to net zero, it's an electric economy. It's electric houses, electric cars, everything is electric. But the electric grid isn't fit for purpose in rural areas. It's about planning. We've got a new minister for Levelling Up who's going to review the planning, but planning is not really working in rural areas. We surveyed our members, and on average, across a whole range of different applications, the average was 10.9 years from starting the process to putting a spade in the ground. And that just inhibits economic potential. Obviously, land use, as we come away from the Common Agricultural Policy, we need to achieve three things. We need to be able to feed the country. We need to be able to turn around the environmental, the loss of environment, the environmental recovery, and also achieve net zero. And there's big challenges around that. And then around the taxation system that in places we think could unlock investment. And I think at the heart of this is how government works. Our concern is DEFRA do a very good job. They do rural affairs, but they are just one department. And actually, things that matter in the rural economy go across a whole range of government departments. And so how government works effectively, I think, is important. I think rural proofing isn't working as well as it should, and often rural is an afterthought when it really shouldn't be. So much of it is focused on what's achieved in an urban environment, which often doesn't work in rural areas, whether it's around housing, energy policy, connectivity of all sorts. So those are some of my sort of opening thoughts, and hopefully we'll get some questions on that. So, Richard.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be back at DEFRA. It's nearly a decade since I was last a minister. I come back to a very different department, going from one that was 80% of what we did was sort of transacting policy done from somewhere else to doing it ourselves. And it's with that comes some fantastic opportunities and some huge challenges. I really want to drive the rural affairs brief in my brief moment in the sun, and I want to make sure that we are doing many of the things that Mark has just covered. But if I did nothing else, if the government did nothing else, Project Gigabit is the one thing that is going to unlock the rural potential of so many people and businesses. It's about not just getting connectivity to the town or the village, it's going right up the valley to a remote set of farm buildings where you can run a world-class business with people locally who are able to work in that business and make it succeed. So that is an absolute priority. And then I want to get as much of the 4.8 billion in the Shared Prosperity Fund to get to rural areas. Mark rightly mentioned rural proofing, and I have the scars on my back of trying to do this in the past, and I know how now to do it. And whether I'll succeed or not will be, we've achieved quite a lot over the last decade or two, but he's absolutely right that this is a challenge. And if you look at the sort of negatives in life, almost any negative that could affect you, a loss of job, ill health, mental illness, poverty, almost anything that you can think of that could affect you in a negative way is exacerbated by rurality. And so when we bring in a change to universal credit or pension or skills or almost any area of government, we have to make sure that we are thinking of those people who live in remote areas. And so it's not just about unleashing the potential of the rural economy, it's also about social inclusion. And when we talk about levelling up, I think actually levelling out of the towns and cities, out into the rural communities, and making them feel part of what we're trying to do. So my intro is full, and it is a real challenge, and I hope that we can tease out some of this in further questions later. Thank you very much.
Neil. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and can I say to the CLA that it's always a pleasure to have you before the Select Committee and give us some common sense advice. Government doesn't always take it, but we give it to them nonetheless. But also, can I say it's great to have Richard back, and I hope it's not a short time in the sun, Richard. And it's great to have somebody who was a really good Fisheries Minister and really understood that issue. He understands rural proofing, and I think this is something that we really need to get right, because we've never really done it properly before. Because much of what happens in the rural areas is the same as what happens across all constituencies in the country, and that is your health service, your schools, as well as your rurality. And so very much agree with Richard that connection of broadband and gigabit is absolutely essential, and that will help with some of the travel issues. But we've also got to, how do we get our students to colleges? How do we get them there? Because your rural buses don't work, the subsidies are massive. So do we look for some sort of scooters and others, the transport for them? We've got to think slightly outside the box to get everybody working properly. We've also got to accept that we have a very much an aging population. How do we get that right? You know, our community hospitals, all of those things. I've got 3 in my own constituency, you know, which have been run down really in the past. They need to be built up, not run down. You know, Tiverton High School, again, we need a new school there. All of these things will help with the agenda of raising people up, because I think we've all got to, you know, what is levelling up or levelling out? Or, you know, everybody's asking questions, everybody's got a slightly different view on it. But I think the whole idea is to try and make us, you know, especially those that are struggling in life, more prosperous, but also to have more aspiration. And I think that is absolutely key as we move forward. So I like Richard, think it can be done. I mean, on the farming side, we need to get these payments sorted out so that farming knows where it's going. We need to get processing industry working properly. If we need labour, let's bring them in and actually do it. And we only have them for a limited time, train up our own labour afterwards. But what we can't do is export our business if we don't import enough labour to do it. So let's not get tied up too much on the politics of this. Let's get the rural areas working, because you see, farming is important, but it's about 113 billion the food industry and processing is worth to this country. So combine the two, and especially in the rural towns that we've got, a lot of people work in processing, a lot of people work in my constituency, a lot go into Exeter. So how do they get there? And I think, we've got to work to make sure that we won't reinvent the wheel. So we have got to make sure that those hubs, Exeter in Devon is a real driving force for the whole of Devon. And we've got to embrace that, and we've got to work into it. And so I think it's how we get all of this joined up in order to make sure that as we move forward, the constituencies that are rural get their fair share. And much as I love the north of England, don't forget the west of England, whatever you do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was struck when I was preparing for this panel by a comment made by one of your colleagues, Diana Davidson, on one of our panel events earlier this week. She said, levelling up is kids being able to grow up knowing they can stay in their hometown, get a decent job, and live a decent life. Now, maybe if we would replace the word town, I think the panel here would agree with me that the same applies to the rural community and the rural economy. So, Mark, if I could go to you first and say, what do you think we need to see to make that happen for our rural communities?
Well, picking up on your point, a home, a job, and a life.
Yeah.
So I think the life bit, the rural areas have so much to offer. I think, we all understand that. I think the home and the job is key. I think I can see one of the results of COVID is this massive increase in house prices in rural areas, which is a big problem. And the reduction in the number of affordable houses coming out of the rental sector, and so getting houses into rural areas, particularly affordable houses, so that people who are working there can stay there, is absolutely crucial. On the jobs, I think the gigabyte connectivity is, as Richard said, is absolutely crucial, and that is it provides such huge opportunities. But we've still got, the government have said 1.2 billion they're going to spend. They before the election they said they were going to spend 5 billion. And they've rowed back on their ambition to 85% rather than 95%, I think it was. We need to keep their feet to the fire on that, because the speed of that rollout is absolutely crucial. I see it where in my part of Northumberland, where non-existent broadband has now got fibre to the properties, and then people can work from home. It's extraordinary, and it unlocks, and it means people can live and work there. So I think more affordable, how we get affordable housing into local areas is crucial, and that's connected to the planning system.
And Neil, do you see similar issues in your constituency?
Yeah, I think the beauty of the countryside means that people come and buy houses. They come from London, they spend a fairly small house, in London, and can buy a bigger house in the countryside. And so that's great in many respects, but it then makes it very unaffordable for those very often that are working there. So it's how do we have, shared ownership? How do we have access for people that they can get their mortgages and they can have a guarantee? And, government, we have put forward policies for that, and we need more of that, so that the younger generation, they have to wait too long now before they can raise a mortgage to be able to get a house. Pod system, where Mid-Devon is sort of first in the west to start putting up pod houses, which basically are very good prefabricated houses, and they really are very good quality. I've seen them. You can put them on sort of garage sites and all sorts of things. You do them quickly. So we've got to, without downgrading the houses, we've got to make sure there is houses available which are competitively priced and competitively built. And the point you make, Mark, is the planning system needs to be absolutely faster on the draw, because it takes too long. And if we do, and it's very controversial when we release more land, because it'll be interesting to see what Michael Gove balances, the rights of people to object to building to the needs of actually building those homes. And that's going to be the huge challenge, because if we can release some more land, we can actually build more homes. We still haven't built on all of our brownfield sites. And I think the other possibility for some really good housing, and hopefully perhaps not too expensive, is we're going to have to really fundamentally look at our town centres. I mean, I've been into, you know, unfortunately this morning with my wife, because I hate shopping, into some of the centres here in Manchester. There is nobody in them. You know, and you know, we are not going to keep all of our shops actually going in our town centres, whether we like it or not. Because how many of you buy online? How many more are buying online? All the time we're doing it. And so there'll be fewer need for fewer premises. That's where we can actually reinvigorate our town centres. And I think actually in a lot of our town centres, we can get some really cost-effective housing. And that will help generally, not all with all the rural areas, but you see, many of our rural areas come into our towns, our rural towns and villages. So, you know, when we talk about reality, we've got to also build into our rural towns and then out into our villages and hamlets, because that's how our economy is driven. And I think, you know, don't again reinvent the wheel, just make that wheel turn faster and work better.
Richard, we're talking about home, jobs, lives, and that obviously covers, it's all your responsibility, but it also involves many different departments. How's that going to work in practice, do you think? And how easy will it be to work with colleagues on these issues?
Well, DEFRA has a role across government on rural proofing, and we are exercising that very forcefully. Just in one tiny example, there is this concept in Whitehall called the right-around. Before any policy can be announced, it has to go around every department, and most of them are just a nil return because it's something that doesn't affect your department. I now go through every right-around in exhaustive detail. For example, I discovered the other day that there's a very good new skills policy that is being developed, but I discovered a part of it was that that children should have that skills guidance that is going to be provided with all this extra money after the school day and not interrupt their lessons. And that is immediately discriminating against a child who lives a long way away from a town because he'll miss the bus. And his mum will have to leave work early to go and collect him. Just a tiny thing, but in terms of quality of life and equal opportunity. So the right around is something that we are going very strong on. On housing, we're saying to what used to be called MHCLG is now called Deluxe or something. I haven't quite got my head around it. That we can help them. Part of the problem, and there'll be people in this room who feel very strongly about it because they will feel that they have been the victim of large-scale house building by the volume builders in the southeast of England, and they've had enough. And there have been very clear messages given in recent by-elections and things about this. And the government is wrestling with it. We need to build more houses. We need to provide for the demands of our future population. But it is causing severe problems, not least in the constituency that I used to represent. But I think we can, in DEFRA, we can help, because the more popular developments, or the smaller ones in the rural communities, they're not loved by everyone, but where a community is allowed to grow organically. And having some sort of rural housing commitment is what we're working very hard to achieve, and working with the Rural Coalition, with the CLA and others to make sure that it's our offer to another government department who have a problem, which we think we can go a long way to solve, but we won't solve it unless we also solve the planning issues that have been raised. And I'm absolutely clear about this. There are redundant farm buildings right across rural Britain that can have the most wonderful, there can be more people working in them than were working at the height of agricultural employment in the 19th century, in real jobs, creating real things that people want to buy. And so we have got to make it easier for those sorts of developments to go ahead, and we're working hard on that.
Can I just say to Richard that we've been trying to get this done for 10, 12 years now, and Oliver Letwin and others did a lot of work on it in the past. So I really wish you well, because it's got to be done, because they're out there. Some of them can be, you know, very much industrial and small industrial, light industrial estates. Others can be developed for housing as well. But the planners, every time we alter the law, the planners come in and mess it all up again, Richard. So you've got to make sure this time you get it 125% right, and they don't do that, because it's been very frustrating, because we've had this, you know, permitted development rights, all sorts of things, but they just haven't quite worked out, because the planners have brought in structural things and all sorts of things. I mean, in the end, as long as the site is right for some limited development, then develop it, not start messing about with, oh, the buildings aren't suitable and this and that. The whole idea was to use these sites, I think, as brownfield sites, and limit the amount going on them, but make sure that you can develop them. But over the years, we've made a real sort of hash of actually getting this done, because I agree with you 100%, but it's something that I've been working on for a very long time, and I'm sure you can do a good job on it, all right? And I wish you well, because there is a problem there.
Any councillors in the room? I firmly support local authorities declaring a climate emergency, because there is one. But what is the impact of that? The impact is how it is interpreted by some planning officials is that developments which bring jobs can't happen in rural areas because it requires a car to get there. Well, we're all going to be driving electric cars in quite a short space of time. You know, we mustn't misinterpret well-meaning legislation. We must get jobs into the countryside, and we mustn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That is a classic example of where we're missing a trick.
I think if I can just say, one of the facts that I found most startling in CLA's pamphlet was that the rural economy is currently 18% less productive than it could be, and that equates to around 43 billion of missed income a year. Mark, what do we need to be doing to close that? Obviously, there's the points that have just been raised, but what more would you like to see government do to support that?
Well, I think it's the infrastructure to help unlock that, I think, are the key things. You know, we've talked about some of these points already around connectivity. One thing I think that hasn't really been talked about, and is a great, I've got a real concern about, you know, if we think back over the last few years, we've talked about rural being left behind with mobile phone connectivity or broadband, and that's now well understood, and there is progress, there needs to be more. But the next big one, I think, that worries me is around electricity. And, you know, we know all the commitments that I expect the Prime Minister will make tomorrow, and the commitments that have already been made around the journey that we're on. But it's an electric economy, and everything about it is electric. And yet in rural areas, we can generate renewable energy in various means, and we need to be able to have electric cars and so on. But time and time again, we find with our members, you know, 4 out of 5 times they'll come up with a project, a renewable project, and they won't be able to get a grid connection. So it's not necessarily a planning issue, but it's the grid not being able to plug into the grid to be able to feed green energy into the grid. And then from a consumer point of view, those of us living in rural areas, you know, we're all going to be driving electric cars in 10 years' time. You know, how are we going to be able to connect to that? And so what's really important now, you know, this is the next 10 to 15 years. We must make sure that the infrastructure is put in place at a rural area, as well as, you know, in the urban conurbations and on the motorways. And if we think of what they've tried to do on broadband, what they call outside in, so doing the hard to reach places first rather than the easy places, you know, that would be a great that would really stimulate rural economies, because I think if you have that and you have good connectivity, and we can help on the planning side, you know, those are the 3 key things that I think will really help.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to? I would just like to ask both Neil and Richard the very mean question, which I think has to be asked, given the title of this panel. Is this government taking rural communities for granted?
I'll let the Minister go first.
Yeah.
course we're not. The ministerial team at DEFRA, every single one of us comes from the rural community. We've been brought up in them, the Secretary of State and all the ministerial team. I've spent my life managing or trying to manage farm and a rural business and representing a rural area. And it's sort of what gets me up in the morning. I really know what I would like to do. And it is, reading this document is actually quite a good study, because I've been ticking the items that I could do and my ministerial colleagues could do, but most of them are from across government. And it's trying to make sure that ministers and other departments really make this happen. And when I was originally doing rural proofing in the coalition government, I spoke to a peer called Ewan Cameron, who was a predecessor of Mark's. And he said, when he tried to do this in the Labour government, he was up against it, and people nodded and they said, yes, so it really matters. And it was only when he found a Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Paul Boateng, who really got it. And it was just before they went out of office. But he said he was making people do things across Whitehall that reflected the needs of a rural community. And in government now, we have a Chancellor of the Exchequer who represents one of the most rural constituencies. We've got people in the key roles who I'm talking to, and they are nodding, but they are not just nodding. They really are going to make this happen. And so I'm an eternal optimist. I think if our party was so stupid as to take rural communities for granted, we would pay a heavy price, not least with those seats that we won, like Bishop Auckland and others, which are where we have a duty of trust to deliver for people who mind desperately about their landscape, about their businesses, about the rural economy around where they live and the activities that they enjoy. And it is a very broad canvas. And it goes right from trying to sort out the general licenses issue on one end through to making sure we have sensible planning policies that reflect their needs. So I hope I can convince you that the answer to your question is that we do.
Right, well, I would say that in DEFRA, we've probably never had a better team of rural ministers and rural-based ministers. And we've got a great Chancellor who represents a very rural seat in Richmond, Yorkshire. But I think what we've got to be careful as a government is that we've got to deliver. And in order to deliver, it's not just DEFRA, it is very much about planning. On the DEFRA side, when we bring in environmental controls on poultry units, pig units, all of these things, for goodness sake, get them done much quicker so that we can get new units in place. They're much better environmentally, and we can do so much more. And I think our hearts are absolutely in the right place, but I think our constituents have still got faith in us, but they are beginning to say, where are the Conservatives on this? And I mention the word trade, because, we do have to actually have fair trade deals in the future where we can produce our really high quality food here in this country, very high welfare standards, but with extra costs. We must not be undermined just on welfare, but on cost too. And so we can get those balances right and get the mood music right, then I believe the rural communities believe in us. But I think, there are people beginning to question us. And I am a scrutineer of government, as Richard knows, and I don't fail in my responsibilities, as he well knows. So I'm not being critical, but I think I am being I'm in that place where I can see that people are beginning to question some of our commitments. So I think we can put that right, and I think we've got many things to put it right, but the next couple of years will be imperative as we move forward to actually convince people, because the Labour Party does not represent the countryside. The Tory Party does, but of course with that comes responsibility, and I think we really must be sure that not just saying, oh, we love you in the countryside, but don't necessarily do anything about it, won't actually work. So I think we've got the right policies, but let's put them in place, make them work. You know, if we're going to build the 303, for 9 years we've been going to build the 303, the dualling, and we haven't put a digger in the ground anywhere from Andover to Ilminster. So for goodness sake, you know, that's the sort of thing that people like to see happening, and then they feel something's going on. So I think we've got the right things in place, but we're just not doing it fast enough. And this minister is going to get it done much faster. I'm convinced of that.
This minister is coming out with quite a lot to do and quite a lot of pressure on his plate.
That was said with quite a lot of menace.
No, surely not, Richard.
Select committee chair.
So Neil's got in there already with the 303, but I'll let him pick another. If you had ultimate power, and I'm going to come to the audience for questions after this, but if you had ultimate power to do just one thing that would help the rural community, what would you do? Mark, do you want to go first? Anything.
Okay. I think I would accelerate the rollout of broadband and mobile.
Very good.
Ditto.
Yeah, I would be the same, but coupled with housing as well, and doing something about our town centres, producing more housing there as well, because a commitment of the broadband and better housing, and especially for younger people, getting on that housing ladder, that's got to be the important part as well.
If I could add just codicil, if I could wave a wand, I'd like to fast forward agriculture through the transition period. 'Cause I absolutely believe that producing food is going to be a noble thing that people are going to want to do, and is going to be able to do it perfectly profitably. But we're going to go through tough times. And there are people currently farming who won't be farming. There are people, frankly, who are farming who want to stop, but they've got to be helped in that process, and we've got to get young people into the, and lower the average age of farmers. I'd like to be able to fast forward farming 5 years, because I think it's going to be a good profession and one that will attract people.
Yeah, but as we change DEFRA's policy, we must not complicate it too much, and we're making it too complicated already, and that will be key, Richard, because we have got to keep it so that the farmers understand what they're doing for the environment, but they're also producing food. And I think we are getting it right now, but I think we have to make sure that food is at the centre of the environment and agriculture, and I think that's, I mean, I'm sorry to bore you to death with it, but I will bore you to death while I have breath in my body on this particular issue.
I think with the digital point in particular, with the lockdown, and particularly with children and their need to learn, and I think rural communities already, school and education is a real problem in many rural communities, and actually the schools aren't up to scratch, and pupils aren't getting the challenge that they need far more than in many inner urban areas, inner city towns. And it's all well and good managing to get a laptop to somebody, but if their laptop can't link up and they can't actually stream their teacher without it jittering every 30 seconds, it's absolutely pointless. And how can we say we're helping all of the young people across the country when that is the case? I keep promising to come to the audience for questions, and I can see you glaring at me because I haven't, but I am now going to do so. So there are two gentlemen, three people in a row. Well, should we take all those questions together then?
Lots of questions, yeah.
Council. I'm wondering if we're doing enough to develop brownfield sites. Often very expensive for developers to move forward on, contamination. Should we be doing more to encourage the development of these sites?
Thank you. Trevor, very excellently you did it, but I forgot to say, please do say your name and where you're from. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Iona Parker. I'm a district council in Braintree in Essex. I just wonder whether the panel would feel that schools in rural areas are adequately funded. And as I'm sure you know that if you live in a rural area, you only have one choice of school, and that's the school that the school bus goes to. And so I do have a concern that they may be disadvantaged opposed to children in urban areas.
Yes, good afternoon. Peter Stevens from Suffolk, but I'm also chairman of the Conservative Rural Forum. I'll slightly move away from planning because although I sit on the planning committee, my colleagues to the right also, I would just ask whether the manifesto commitment to animal sentience will put rural communities under pressure and prevent farmers earning sensible living because of urban thought process into the rural way of life.
Shall we tackle those in the order that they came in? So do you want to come in on brownfield development first, Mark?
Sure. So on brownfield, yes, I think we should be encouraging brownfield. I think in a rural context, I think we should also, I mean, it's been touched on, I can't remember whether it was Neil, but the, historic old farm buildings, all these lovely Victorian buildings that we've got around the country, they make fantastic homes, offices, workshops, but quite often we find, talking to members across the country, that they're not in a sustainable location. They might now have super fast broadband, and in reality, in a 21st century, they are sustainable, and they make fantastic hubs. So I think we should think of all things that are already been built on, I think is a good place to start. Because there's nothing worse than seeing old buildings dilapidated. And I think a lot of the problems around carbon, I don't think we accurately measure a new house, the carbon impact, the inherent carbon in that, versus an existing building. There's been a lot of interesting research done about that, and using existing buildings surely makes much more sense. So that's my comment on brownfield.
And if I could just actually echo your point, I think that there's this point around rural developments and new buildings and things like that, where with the net zero agenda, there's this idea that heat pumps are the fixer for everything, but actually there are a lot of areas within the rural space where heat pumps aren't going to be the most efficient option, and pushing them in one way to make it the most sustainable can actually make it less sustainable in the long run. Brownfield development.
Yeah, I mean, where there's brownfield developments, we've got to encourage development to go there. A house builder, particularly a volume house builder, loves a bit of greenfield.
Yeah.
They can go in with a machine. They don't have to pay the decontamination costs of many brownfield sites. And so where they exist, of course, we should continue to push them there. But also, I think we should recognize a vernacular. We should recognize a sense of place. We should build nice homes. We should make homes that are not only beautiful to live in, but are cheap to live in. And one of the great problems with the rural housing stock is trying to get it to perform to the energy performance standards that are required. This is a massive burden on rural house providers. And so I think we need to build more houses in the right place as quickly as we can. I'll come on to the other questions later, shall I?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that Mark makes was a good one, but I think we've got to go much wider. You see, I don't think it's just about those pretty buildings that need to be developed. I think it's also about those absolutely awful farming sites of galvanized and God knows what that are just falling down, because the farmers are not going to get rid of them, because they're going to hang on to them, and eventually they know they will get something there. So I think we can adapt that. And I think what we've got to do, trouble with planning is if the site, say, 2 or 3 acres, and you grant it planning permission, under our present law, you can sort of build God knows how many houses on it. So what we've got to do is have clear restrictions on these sites on exactly what you can build. But I don't think you need to rely so much on the types of buildings. Let's take out these brownfield sites. Let's build on them. Let's put some industrial building there, perhaps with some housing, because if they're fairly isolated but we can get broadband there, there's no reason why we can't do that. You see, the other issue planning will say, oh, well, they're too isolated. The road's not right. The road's not aligned. All of these things are always a reason to stop it. Now, I'm not saying we can build in our most rural areas, but we can actually do much more. I mean, I've got villages at East Devon say are unsustainable. Well, of course they're unsustainable because they won't allow a barn to be converted or anything to be built. Even when the villagers come up with their own local plan, they have to fight it through the local government officers to get it there. So, you know, that's where we can do a lot more. And I think if we can take people with us, and I think if they saw brownfield sites, even, you know, I said, one planning officer said to me, you will not build on every rotten farming site in the country. And I said, well, why not? And he looked at me rather blankly at that stage. But, you know, this is the issue. It's not whether those buildings are suitable. Those buildings are there, and they will remain there forever because they will just moulder away. And that's where we have got, you know, to think a little bit outside the box. Now, I probably ought to declare an interest because I've probably got some buildings that fit that state. But seriously, I think, you know, this is where we have got ourselves into a conundrum where every time we move the goalpost, the planning officers find a way of stopping us. And this time, I think we've got to have a real limit on the amount of development, but not take too much notice about what those type of buildings are. And then I think we could release probably 2 or 3 times as many sites as we've got already.
Iona and Peter, I am going to come back to your questions. Can I quickly ask the audience, if for yourselves, perhaps for your children, maybe for your grandchildren, do you worry about home affordability in rural areas? Hands up if you are concerned about it for the future.
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. Schools and rural funding, is enough attention given to the unique problems that rural areas have for the young people in their schools? Shall I shake it up? Shall we go to you, Richard, first, particularly so Mark can stop joking?
I went to a primary school where there were 11 pupils in the whole school, and now about 111 because it merged with the neighbouring school. Through education policy, while there's been a Conservative government, my Liberal Democrat opponent always said this is going to result in rural schools closing. And I don't think in West Berkshire we lost a single rural school in the 25 years that I've been active in politics there. And it's one of the great, but it matters. It matters for that community's sense of worth. It matters because if it closes, people have to travel further. The community itself is diminished, and it ends up having to probably be a nil cost benefit because of the changes you have to make to other schools. So I desperately think we need to make sure that we are fairly funding, Iona, the rural schools. And I mean, I know that in West Berkshire, the per pupil payment is roughly half that which a child gets per head in Hackney. Now, in Hackney, they have some serious issues and challenges, but I wonder whether we've got this quite right. Local authorities no longer have their fingers on the control of this to the degree they had, because we have a much more plural system of education and with academies and what not. But we need to make sure that we are keeping these places there for so many reasons, and that we could have a debate on that, which could take all the time that we have this afternoon.
Mark.
Yeah, so I'm not an education expert, but my own experiences in Northumberland, which is a far less populated part of the country than West Berkshire, is that once you lose a school, it's gone forever, and that's a real tragedy in a community. I know my own experience at our local village, the numbers got down really low, and it teetered, and everyone came together to try and boost it, and now it's thriving. And so I think that per head funding, I think, really needs to be looked at, because once you lose a school, it's a disaster in that community, as everyone knows. So I think, in some of the more remote areas, we do need to think about the per head funding and the extra costs that are involved in running a small school with small numbers.
Yeah, brilliant. And Neil, can I ask you to tackle the schools and then also the animal sentience? Then we can go back along.
I will. I'll do both. Yeah, on schools, I think I've belonged now for sort of the last 10, 12 years to a fair share for schools across the country, where we've been trying to move money, not actually take money away from the city centres, but actually cap that level of funding and then move more to the rural areas, because Devon is another county that struggles. And of course we do have small schools, and I think, my wife is a teacher, and so is my daughter, and so you have to be careful with schools, because you have got to have them of a reasonable size, because you've got to have enough. I'm fortunate enough to have a very bright granddaughter. Now, she went to a very small school. Luckily, she had another very bright child there with her. there. But if you don't have enough children in the school, you actually hold those children back. So I go to villages and say, what you need to do is produce more children, get on with it. And I think they misunderstand me sometimes. But I think, you know, that is absolutely key to it, because you do have to have enough numbers. When you get down to 12, 15 or 20 children in a school, it's not enough. It really isn't. You probably need 40 or 50 to make that school work, perhaps to get away with 30, 35 sometimes, but that's the issue. So I think that's not easy to solve, but I think it's funding and also making sure sometimes there is necessity to combine schools, but I don't like to see it happen, but there might be justification for it. And then as far as sentience is concerned, you know, I mean, my view is that the Select Committee, we managed to kick this thing into the long grass a couple of years ago, and why on earth the government brought it back again? It could be a manifesto commitment, I suppose, but surely if we can tear up one on taxation, we can probably tear up one on sentience. I mean, we do need to make sure that we have a very good animal welfare policy in this country, but the trouble with sentience is that virtually everything, every animal, every crustacean feels some form of pain. And the problem with this is we're going to land up, if we're not careful, in huge arguments about what a sentience is and what it isn't. We're going to set up this particular committee to look at it. Now, if we set the committee up in the right way, with the right chair, we may well get away with it. But goodness knows what future governments will make of this. So let's be careful how we do it. We're going to do it. I accept all that now. But I think it was a mistake in the first instance because, believe it or not, the European legislation on this was beautifully vague and it was absolutely perfect for the situation. But, of course, we didn't carry it across, and then we got ourselves into a little pickle, and we said we'll set up, you know, we'll have sentience legislation. So we are where we are, better than it was because it won't be so judicially reviewed as the previous one would be, but it's not easy to deal with because it's not to do only with DEFRA, you see. It's to do with building a road, building a school, building anything. HS2, all of you that want to stop HS2, you've got a wonderful, wonderful platform now. I better not tell you that as councillors, had I? But seriously, you know, this is the issue with it. So much as we want to be very strong on animal welfare, we do also have to be able to govern in many other ways. So I think we're getting it better than it was, and it will be done. And I'm sure Richard will say it's a marvellous thing. But, you know, I'm worried about it still.
Richard, should we let you answer for yourself?
So I'll give you the quick version. I differ slightly from Neil on this. We have lived with animal sentience as part of legislation since the Lisbon Treaty was signed. That was a mistake. It wasn't transposed. There was a row. The government committed to do it, and we made mistakes. And this is where select committees actually work. They said this is poor legislation. We said we agree. This is long before I was there, obviously. And we have now brought in a piece of legislation which replaces it back in the acceptance of sentience and creates this committee. But if you're a farmer and you're doing everything that a good farmer should do, or a fisherman that is doing everything, or somebody who keeps, you know, pets or whatever, you've got nothing to fear from this legislation. But as policy, and our understanding about animal welfare is a very fast-moving area of science, policymakers should have recourse to expert advice. Now, if they say, we don't think you should be killing, I'm getting down dangerous rabbit hole here, but killing meat with religious rights involved. A minister can say, thank you, we've received that information, but we believe culturally that with the right controls that should happen. Same with pest control, you know, killing predators that are killing rare species that we're trying to protect. There is a wider dimension to it, which a minister can say, well, thank you. Of course, it's not very nice for a crow to be trapped, but the wider benefit of saving the curlew from going to extinct means that we are going to allow that predator to be controlled. That is the way we have constructed this. So nobody has anything to fear if they are doing things properly, and ministers right across government will have recourse to the right kind of up-to-date, modern advice about the impact that their legislation could have on animals that are sentient.
Thank you. Do we have some more questions? Lots. Okay, let's try and get through these three here, and then we'll come to you two afterwards, and we'll rattle through our responses, so we definitely have time.
Okay, speed up.
Hello, Francis Salverson. We've touched on some of the things about having more workers, perhaps from the EU. How are we going to incentivise rural farms and firms to automate so that we are not reliant on manual labour?
Thank you. And the gentleman just behind.
Oliver Kerr from North Devon. I know we don't need too many more Devon voices. We've got a fantastic representative on the panel. But I'd like to. There's so many points that could be brought up. Issues like loneliness, pubs in villages, community centres. Yeah. You know, towns are important, but our big villages like mine in Combe Martin on the edge of Exmoor, you know, and there's villages that are losing pubs, and that's been particularly over the pandemic. Farmers who have worked hard and been out in the fields, in rural communities, have not been able to get together with their friends and family. And so supporting things like pubs is really important. But my main point is to talk about connectivity. You know, coastal and rural areas combined. You know, there's only one way in and one way out to most of those places. And so investing in our rural roads network is really important. In Devon, we know it better than anyone. Our county council is the largest rural road network in the country we have to manage. When you see things like HS2 being spent a ton of money on, and the potholes aren't being filled because there's not enough money for the council, there's a question whether the Conservative government are the ones that are supporting the rural community.
Thanks very much. I'm afraid you are going to get another voice from Devon. I think there's a sort of nest of Devonians here. But my name's Toby Williams. Thank you very much for a brilliant event. Obviously, key to levelling up rural areas is transport connectivity, as was just mentioned. But since the pandemic, rail numbers specifically have gone down dramatically. With that backdrop, how will that make Neil's and other people's jobs harder when they go to government and ask for more money for transport infrastructure upgrades? For example, the Devon Metro, which would enable me to go to one of the many excellent pubs in Honiton or Axminster in Neil's constituency and be able to choose from 2 trains an hour to get me home rather than just 1.
Thank you. Okay, Richard, do you want to go first on rail and roads and automation?
There is a current and very real and live issue around workers that support agriculture in various different forms, and ongoing discussions. And you heard what the Secretary of State said about easing the language test criteria for certain people and as part of the farming supply chain. But your question was wider. It was about the impact of automation. And yes, jobs, work. What we need to do is to take the farming community on a journey and describe what it's going to be like farming in 10, 15 years' time. You're going to be farming without diesel. You're going to be growing more energy crops. You're going to be still producing food, and you will be using much more automated systems, which will be better for the environment because you'll be using more bespoke applications of fertilizers and sprays, and it will be a greener and more diverse landscape as a result, and hopefully you will be rewarded if we have successive continued governments who really mind about it. You will be rewarded for doing that. Do you want me to go on to the other questions? Or
very quick thoughts on rail and roads.
Actually, it links with Oliver's question as well about loneliness and community facilities. It all ties together, and that's why you can't look at it. That's why government thinking can often get this wrong, because you're thinking, oh, transport is just about this. Actually, it's about loneliness and isolation as well. It's about the pub and the importance of the sense of community. And I battled hard as an MP against any application that for a pub to become a house, and sometimes, or houses. Sometimes I won, sometimes I didn't. And I think one of the best bits of legislation we brought in the last time I was in government, which was the one where community asset. And there are pubs in the constituency I used to represent that are now run by the local community and supported by it, and they still are that hub. But the other thing about working in the countryside is that all those human events that brought people together, like the mart, very often cattle now sold online, or they are taken to a mart where farmers don't know each other the way they did when it was local. It's about the infrastructure that supports that community. And we have to recognize that when I talked about rurality exacerbating the negativities in life, loneliness is the most apparent thing. I canvassed one village in my constituency in the middle of one election, and all I found there were elderly people. And I asked one of them when she had last spoken to someone, and it was 6 days. 6 days without speaking to someone, and because her family a generation ago would have lived in the village or lived nearby. Her daughter lived in New Zealand and her son lived in Newcastle, and it just, that dynamic has changed, and we've got to find ways and local ways of doing it. It can't come from the minister's desk. It has to come from a local initiatives. I could go on for much longer, but I haven't.
I'm going to go to the last few questions. It was just this gentleman here and then just the gentleman there. So Elizabeth, right up at the front here.
Thank you. Dominic Bowick, West Berkshire, and proud Cornishman. I've seen for myself the harm that second home ownership has done to small villages and communities where they're lifeless in winter and the young families have had to move away. At the same time, that brings money and jobs into the local economy. So how do we strike the right balance?
Brilliant. And then just the gentleman in the grey suit, could you give me a wave again? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tom Ashton, I'm Portfolio for Planning at East Lindsey District Council in Lincolnshire. I wholeheartedly welcome your words on reusing existing buildings, and I heartily invite any member of the panel who want to appear on the screen at my Planning Policy Committee when I try and drive this through as part of our local plan review. My fundamental point, however, is I genuinely welcome the personnel we currently have in DEFRA and the countryside approach that we appear to be getting. Can you please run that over to the Environment Agency, and which is so risk-averse, so dogmatic, at times it's like a last outpost of New Labour with its virtual signalling groupthink. And I just wondered if we could get that same kind of common sense countryside approach and run it right the way through to their attitude to the planning system to recognise that the seawalls aren't going to collapse and the tide isn't going to come in forever. So if you could do that, I'd be very, very grateful.
Thank you, Tom. Mark, Second Homes Environment Agency, and any final thoughts?
Okay, so second homes, I think it's a big, big problem, and also furnished holiday lets. COVID is in the honeypot areas. I come from one where houses, the temptation for people is to take houses out of long-term rental in the local communities and put them, because their money is so much more attractive to do furnished holiday lets. And it's a huge problem. And I think we need to put, it's obviously it's a local government issue, really, but I think we need to put restrictions in place so that there are some houses, I completely agree. I run a furnished holiday let business myself, but there needs to be a balance. And I think you do need to restrict some houses for people who live and work in those communities. I really believe that. And also bringing in affordable housing. We need to work out a way, there's some suggestions in here, of how we can stimulate affordable housing in these rural areas, because that brings in young people and young families, that keeps the pub going and all these other things that we've been talking about.
Thank you. Neil, any quick thoughts from you?
Yeah, I'm going to do a quick roundup on all those, because on the Labour, DVLA has got to make sure that HGV licences can be trained and issued much more quickly. Let's train up our own Labour. We're shooting ourselves in the foot here. We need about 800 butchers alone in the pork industry to add value to those carcasses to get them processed. Again, we can produce our homegrown Labour, but not in 5 minutes. So therefore, allow some people in the meantime. Don't be dogmatic pragmatic over it, be practical, because otherwise, if we don't import labour, we'll export our industry. But in the meantime, as we import that labour, let's actually train up our own people. A lot of these jobs are quite well paid, actually. So it's not about payment altogether. It's about having the trained people and actually perhaps changing sometimes their idea of what these jobs are like. Pubs, community pubs, yes. Community centres as well. Again, we do need the charitable sector and everybody to work together, and we need to stimulate the charity sector more with some help, perhaps paying the rates, perhaps paying some fuel on transport in the rural areas, because you won't get that to work competitively because of the numbers. Rail, again, I think people will come back to rail, and I think we've got to keep going. Hopefully Rebecca and I have got one. She's got a station in Wellington and we got one coming in Columpton. We will build that then up to Axminster, so you will get to be able to go to the pub twice a week or twice a day, and then also with second home ownership, I think difficult one. I think we've got to try, and we are beginning to tax it more, so we'll get concentrating people's minds. Some areas would work. You know, we like people to come in, but we then find they are taking the home. So it's a one that we've got to sort out. Not every village, not every settlement can be sorted out in the same way, because some areas you just will not create employment, will you? And that's a difficult one for us. And on the Environment Agency, most definitely, they need sorting out, because they are being too pedantic about the licensing. They're taking too long with flooding and managing flood management and putting new payments in for farmers to hold flood water. They're sort of saying there's very limited funds when there should be greater funds in order to make this work. So I think we can get it to work, but you're absolutely right. It needs to be much more open, transparent, and actually let's get people working and moving, not just shut everything down. Now, I'm not saying they do that entirely, but there is a real need to sort that out. That's not, luckily, I don't think actually Richard's responsibility, the Environment Agency, is it? So you're off the hook.
Pass it on.
Thank you, Neil. Right. Minister.
Just on Dominic's point about second homes, I think we can learn a lot from Scotland. It's usually on what not to do. The SNP have long accused, as part of their nationalistic agenda, long accused landowners of emptying the glens when actually rather the reverse. They've been keeping employment in the glens. They've now introduced rent controls, and they've introduced some very complicated means of getting rid of a bad tenant, somebody who doesn't pay their rent and trashes your house. So the upshot of it is that they are emptying the glens. Yeah. People are, when a house comes available, the incentive for the owner is to do it up and sell it on, let it out at Airbnb or as a holiday home. And this is having a devastating effect on parts of rural Scotland. And we can learn a lesson of how not to do things in so many ways by looking at how awful that government is up there. Environment Agency message received. I used to be the floods minister. If I could, when I was not a minister, I would have said that they're very often design a flood scheme that is a Rolls-Royce solution when a reasonably priced family car would have been the perfect solution. But now I'm minister, I think they're marvellous, but I will nevertheless pass on your very heartfelt concerns.
Thank you, Richard. Well done.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for watching along online. Thank you to the CLA for working with us on this. Thank you to Mark. Thank you to Richard. Thank you to Neil for joining us this afternoon. If you'd like to stick around, we have Lord Frost in conversation with Robert Colville very shortly. If not, I wish you a wonderful rest of your conference, and thank you for joining us. Thank you.